Imagine a place far from the bustling cities and winding roads, a place where the silence hangs thick in the air, broken only by the rustle of leaves or the occasional call of a distant crow. Hinterkaifeck was no ordinary farm. Nestled deep in the Bavarian countryside, it was cut off from the nearest village by miles of dense forest and lonely fields. The nearest neighbors lived a good distance away, and anyone traveling to the farm would have to cross rough terrain, navigating dirt paths that seemed to twist endlessly under the weight of the looming trees. This remoteness meant that the farm's inhabitants were left largely to themselves, isolated from the outside world, a fact that would soon take on a far darker meaning. The farm itself, sitting beneath an ever gray sky, was a modest structure aged wood and brick, surrounded by acres of untamed land. In daylight, it might have seemed peaceful, even quaint, but as dusk fell, shadows began to stretch, and the land's silence turned from peaceful to oppressive. The stillness became unnatural, like a suffocating blanket over the farmstead. Visitors to Hinterkaifeck often remarked that something about the place felt off. But it wasn't the isolation that troubled those who knew the Gruber family. It was what happened within the walls of Hinterkaifeck that would forever mark it as one of Germany's most notorious murder sites. As the chilling March winds swept through the trees, few could have guessed that just beyond the forest, a tragedy had already begun to unfold, a tragedy that would leave 6 people dead, and a mystery that would haunt the region for nearly a century. The Gruber family lived a life not unlike countless others in rural Bavaria during the early 20th century. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was known to be a stern and harsh man, his personality casting a shadow over the household. His wife, Cecilia, lived quietly by his side, sharing the burdens of daily farm life. Their daughter, Victoria, was a widow, raising her 2 young children, Cecilia and Joseph, on the farm. Together, they made up a family that, while not without its struggles, seemed to live an ordinary, quiet life on the farm that had been their home for years. But life at Hinterkaifeck wasn't easy. Behind the closed doors of the farmhouse, rumors swirled in the village of tensions and dark secrets. Andreas was a strict, controlling man, and there were whispers of an inappropriate relationship between him and Victoria, rumors that haunted their small community. Yet, despite the struggles within the family, they continued their daily routines, tending to the farm, raising livestock, and living their lives as many rural families did in that era. The Gruber family's isolation is something many can relate to, especially those who have experienced life in rural settings where the outside world feels distant. They were simply trying to make a living, raise their children, and keep the farm running. They weren't wealthy or well known. They were just people doing the best they could in difficult circumstances. And yet, what happened to them was beyond anything anyone could imagine. Victoria, a single mother, protecting her children and doing everything she could to care for them after her husband's death in the war. Little Cecilia, just 7 years old, playing outside in the farm's yard, unaware of the darkness that would soon envelop her home. Even Andreas, despite his rumored harshness, was a man of his time, working hard to keep his family fed and safe, perhaps doing what he thought was best. In the end, the Grubers were not spared the horrors that would befall them. The children, innocent and full of life, were taken, along with the adults, in one of the most brutal and senseless crimes imaginable. The Grubers were not defined by their murderer, but by the lives they lived before that final night. Can you imagine living in such isolation, not knowing that danger was already at your doorstep? How would you have reacted if you had seen the same strange signs around your home? Could anything have been done to save the Grubers before it was too late? In the days leading up to the murders, eerie and unsettling events began to unfold at Hinterkaifeck, events that, in hindsight, seemed like ominous warnings of what was to come. One of the first strange occurrences was the discovery of footprints in the snow footprints that led directly to the house, but never away from it. The family was puzzled by this, as no one had been expected, and the snow surrounding the house was otherwise untouched. It was as if someone had approached the farm and simply disappeared. Adding to the growing sense of unease, Andreas Gruber reported hearing mysterious noises coming from the attic. Night after night, strange thumps and shuffles echoed through the upper floors of the house. Andreas searched the attic several times, but each time he found nothing. Despite his efforts, the noises continued, and an unsettling feeling began to creep over the household. But that wasn't all. Keys to the house went missing, and unfamiliar newspapers were found on the property newspapers that none of the family members recognized. Even the family dog seemed agitated, barking at things no one else could see. All these bizarre happenings left the Grubers on edge, but they carried on with their lives, unaware of the danger that was lurking closer than they could have imagined. These warning signs, dismissed at the time, would later become chilling clues that the killer may have been watching, perhaps even living among them in the days before the brutal murders. For days, Hinterkaifeck remained eerily silent. The family had not been seen at church, and young Kazilia had not shown up for school. In a small village like this, such absences did not go unnoticed. At first, neighbors thought perhaps the family had fallen ill, or that something had come up that kept them from their usual routines. But as more days passed without a word from the Grubers, unease began to spread through the village. Several neighbors, growing concerned, decided to investigate. They gathered together and made their way to the remote farm, uneasy but not yet prepared for what they would find. As they approached, everything seemed normal. Animals were in their pens. The farm was quiet, but something felt off. There was no movement, no sign of life. When the neighbors entered the barn, the horrifying truth finally came to light. There, hidden beneath piles of hay, were the bodies of Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and young Kazilia. All of them had been brutally bludgeoned to death with what appeared to be a heavy farming tool. The gruesome scene was almost too much to bear. But the nightmare didn't end there. Inside the house, the bodies of the family's maid and Victoria's youngest child, Joseph, were discovered, murdered in the same horrifying manner. The entire Gruber family, along with their maid, had been wiped out in one of the most brutal and senseless killings the village had ever seen. Days passed with no sign of the family. Neighbors grew uneasy, but nothing could have prepared them for the nightmare they uncovered. As investigators arrived at Hinterkaifeck and began to assess the scene, the full horror of the crime was laid bare. The barn, where four members of the family had been found, told a chilling story. Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and little Kazilia were all discovered brutally bludgeoned. Their bodies had been covered with hay, as if to conceal the gruesome scene. The blows had been so violent that their skulls were shattered, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable brutality. But the horror didn't stop in the barn. As investigators made their way inside the house, they found the body of the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, lying lifeless in her quarters. She had only been working at Hinterkaifeck for a few hours before she, too, met the same brutal fate. And then, the final and most heartbreaking discovery: 2-year-old Joseph, Victoria's youngest child, was found dead in his crib. He had been killed in a similar manner, his small body showing the same savage violence inflicted on the rest of the family. The sheer brutality of the murders shocked everyone. The bodies had been arranged in strange positions, as if the killer had taken the time to move them after the attack. The family in the barn, in particular, seemed to have been lured there one by one, perhaps hearing the commotion and rushing to help, only to meet the same violent end. The blood-soaked walls and the eerie silence that hung over the farm were an unsettling contrast to the peaceful countryside outside. But why were some family members left in the barn, while others were killed inside? And why hadn't anyone heard the attacks? The isolation of the farm and the methodical nature of the killings raised countless questions. Was it possible that the killer knew the family well enough to move freely around the property without arousing suspicion? Or had they been lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The gruesome revelation was only the beginning of the mystery. One of the most perplexing aspects of the Hinterkaifeck investigation was the absence of a murder weapon. Based on the injuries sustained by the victims, investigators concluded that a mattock, a heavy, sharp farming tool, had likely been used to carry out the brutal killings. But as they scoured the crime scene, there was no sign of this weapon anywhere on the property. The barn, the house, and the surrounding fields were searched thoroughly, yet the tool responsible for the massacre seemed to have vanished without a trace. What made this even more puzzling was the fact that there were no obvious signs of forced entry into the house or barn. The doors were securely locked, and nothing appeared to have been stolen, ruling out a robbery. This left investigators with a chilling possibility. The killer may have used a tool already present on the farm, something Andreas or his family would have used in their everyday work. But if the tool had come from the farm itself, why was it missing? Had the killer deliberately taken it with them to cover their tracks? Or was there another, more disturbing explanation? As the investigators dug deeper, another theory began to form, a theory that would send chills down the spines of the entire village. What if the killer had been living on the farm all along, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Could they have been using the tools on the farm for days or even weeks before the murders? And even more terrifying, could they have continued living there in the aftermath? So, what does this tell us? Could the killer have used a tool already on the farm? Or, even more chilling, had they been living there unnoticed? As the investigation continued, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the killer didn't flee the scene immediately after committing the murders. In fact, it appeared that whoever was responsible had stayed on the farm for several days, living among the bodies of the Gruber family as if nothing had happened. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney in the days following the murders. The animals on the farm had been fed, and fresh hay had been spread in the barn. Inside the house, investigators found evidence that meals had been prepared and eaten after the killings. Despite the gruesome nature of the crime, the farm appeared to be functioning as usual in the days following the massacre, except for one horrific detail: the entire family lay dead. This strange and unsettling behavior raised even more questions. Why would the killer stay behind? Was it to ensure that no one came looking for the family too soon? Or was there some twisted reason they felt comfortable enough to continue living on the property? It seemed that the murderer wasn't in a rush to leave. They didn't act out of panic or fear of being caught. Instead, they stayed, tending to the animals, eating food, and carrying on as though the farm still belonged to the living. This behavior was not only chilling, but also added a deeply unsettling layer to the crime. Whoever killed the family didn't leave in a panic, they stayed, living among the bodies. But why? As investigators delved deeper into the case, they began to formulate several theories about the horrific murders at Hinterkaifeck. At first glance, some considered the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. Perhaps the killer had broken in, expecting valuables, and then panicked, leading to the brutal slayings. But this theory quickly fell apart. Nothing of value appeared to be missing from the farm, and the violence of the murders seemed far too extreme for a mere burglary. This led investigators to explore a more chilling theory that the murders were deeply personal. The brutality of the killings, especially the sheer force used to bludgeon the victims, suggested that the killer harbored intense anger or hatred toward the family. Each member had been struck multiple times, with injuries far beyond what would be necessary to kill. This kind of overkill pointed to someone who had a personal vendetta or connection to the Grubers. Several early suspects emerged. Neighbors who had clashed with Andreas Gruber were briefly considered, but there was no concrete evidence to tie them to the crime. Some speculated that Victoria's complex relationships might have been a factor, particularly her rumored affair with Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer. Schlittenbauer himself became a prime suspect after behaving strangely during the discovery of the bodies. He was calm, almost too familiar with the scene, and his actions raised eyebrows. But despite the suspicions, nothing definitive could be pinned on Schlittenbauer or any of the other early suspects. As each theory was explored, the puzzle only seemed to grow more complicated. The lack of a clear motive, combined with the eerie signs of the killer staying behind, left investigators baffled. The crime didn't seem random, but the pieces just didn't fit any one person. As we dig deeper, the question becomes more haunting. Was the killer someone the family knew all too well? As investigators sifted through the lives of the Gruber family, it became clear that Victoria Gabriel, Andreas's widowed daughter, held secrets that could be critical to understanding the motive behind the murders. Victoria's personal life was far from simple. Central to the investigation was her rumored affair with Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer who had been romantically involved with her in the years leading up to the tragedy. Victoria's relationship with Schlittenbauer raised immediate suspicions. Schlittenbauer had even publicly claimed that he was the father of Victoria's youngest child, Joseph. Yet, in a strange twist, Victoria had filed a paternity suit against him, further complicating their relationship. Was there lingering tension between them? Some theorized that jealousy or unresolved issues surrounding money or custody may have driven Schlittenbauer to violence. After all, he had a vested interest in Victoria and Joseph, and the bitter legal disputes between them suggested there was more beneath the surface than a simple romantic affair. But the layers of Victoria's relationships didn't end with Schlittenbauer. One of the most unsettling rumors surrounding Hinterkaifeck was the alleged incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father, Andreas. It was whispered in the village that Andreas had a controlling and abusive hold over his daughter, and some even suggested that Joseph might have been the product of this disturbing connection. Although no formal charges were ever brought against Andreas, the rumor persisted, casting a dark shadow over the family's dynamic. These two tangled relationships, one with a local farmer, the other with her own father, complicated the investigation. Did Lorenz Schlittenbauer act out of jealousy, or was he somehow caught in the twisted dynamics of the Gruber household? Could Andreas's possessiveness over his daughter have played a role in the violence? The possibilities seemed endless, and each relationship seemed fraught with hidden motives, unresolved tensions, and dark secrets. Could this tangled web of relationships and secrets have been the catalyst for the tragedy? Lawrence Schlittenbauer was more than just a neighbor to the Gruber family. His connection to Victoria and her son Joseph immediately made him a figure of intense scrutiny. When the Grubers failed to show up in town, it was Schlittenbauer who organized a group of neighbors to investigate the eerie silence at Hinterkaifeck. But it wasn't just his role in discovering the bodies that raised suspicion, it was his behavior that followed. As the group approached the farm, Schlittenbauer took charge, leading the others through the barn where the gruesome scene unfolded. Strangely, as others recoiled in horror at the sight of the bodies, Schlittenbauer seemed unnervingly calm. Some reported that he had even handled the bodies, moving things around, which could have compromised the crime scene. His detachment was unsettling, especially for someone who had just stumbled upon such a brutal massacre. This composed demeanor led many to wonder, had Schlittenbauer known what he was going to find that day? His involvement in Victoria's life and his claims of paternity over Joseph gave him a potential motive. Could he have been seeking revenge after their relationship soured, or was his calmness merely the sign of a man hardened by life's hardships? Others wondered if Schlittenbauer's actions during the discovery were the behavior of someone familiar with death, perhaps too familiar. Had he staged the discovery to make it seem as though he was simply a concerned neighbor, when in reality he might have known all along what had happened? His handling of the bodies was bizarre and inexplicable, especially given the gruesome nature of the murders. Was this calmness the mark of a man used to death, or something more sinister? Could Schlittenbauer have been hiding a dark truth? As investigators scrambled to piece together the grisly puzzle at Hinterkaifeck, another theory emerged, a theory that pointed away from the family and their inner circle. Could an unknown drifter or laborer have been responsible for the murders? In the days leading up to the killings, several villagers reported seeing strange men near the farm. One such sighting involved a mysterious figure lingering on the edge of the property, watching the house from a distance. No one in the village recognized the man, and soon after the murders, he was never seen again. This wasn't the only unsettling report. Other villagers had spoken of vagabonds and wandering laborers passing through the area in the months before the crime. Hinterkaifeck was a remote, isolated farm, and it wasn't uncommon for drifters to seek work or shelter in such places. Some believed that one of these strangers could have approached the farm under the guise of needing help, only to turn on the family in a fit of rage, or perhaps with a calculated, darker intent. The idea of a mysterious stranger lurking in the shadows raised more questions than answers. Could someone have taken advantage of the farm's isolation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? And if so, how did they manage to stay hidden for so long? The footprints leading to the house, but not away, the missing murder weapon, the methodical nature of the killings, all of these strange elements fit the profile of an outsider who had come to Hinterkaifeck for a purpose far more sinister than a simple robbery. The theory of the unknown stranger added another complex layer to an already tangled web of suspects. With no solid leads, the investigators were left to wonder, was this horrific crime the work of someone from outside the village, someone who had no ties to the Grubers at all? Could an unknown stranger have been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred at a time when forensic science was still in its infancy, and this created significant challenges for the investigation. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was how much evidence had been lost or compromised, largely due to the actions of curious villagers. Long before the police arrived, neighbors and townspeople, horrified yet drawn by morbid curiosity, had trampled through the crime scene. They moved objects, touched the bodies, and unknowingly contaminated crucial evidence. The barn, where most of the family was found, had been heavily disturbed by those first on the scene. Footprints that could have led investigators to the killer were smudged or destroyed. The bodies were shifted, and items that might have provided key forensic clues were handled without any consideration for preserving the crime scene. Even the house itself, where the maid and young Joseph were found, had been compromised by the time the authorities arrived. Important evidence that could have linked the killer to the crime, such as fingerprints or fibers, was lost forever. Investigators were left with few concrete clues, and the disorganized state of the crime scene made it nearly impossible to reconstruct exactly what had happened in those horrific moments. Adding to the frustration, the police lacked the modern forensic tools that today's investigators rely on. There were no DNA tests, no sophisticated fingerprint analysis, and no advanced technology to track movements or analyze blood spatter. The investigators could only rely on the physical evidence left behind, much of which had already been ruined. This left the investigation at a dead end. With no clear suspect, no reliable physical evidence, and the crime scene contaminated, the case quickly grew cold. But that haunting question remained: what if vital clues were overlooked? What if the answers to the Hinterkaifeck mystery were hiding in plain sight, lost amid the chaos? With contaminated evidence and no solid leads, the investigation hit a wall. But what if there were clues hiding in plain sight? As years turned into decades, the mystery of the Hinterkaifeck murders continued to haunt both investigators and true crime enthusiasts. Despite the passage of time, the case refused to fade away, and modern forensic experts and detectives have revisited the crime with fresh eyes and advanced technology. Yet, even with today's cutting edge forensic tools, DNA analysis, advanced profiling techniques, and enhanced crime scene reconstruction, the case remains as elusive as ever. In the 2000s, German investigators reopened the files, hoping that modern forensic methods might succeed where the original investigation had failed. They combed through the surviving evidence, hoping to extract DNA from items recovered at the scene. But the contamination of the crime scene and the degradation of evidence over the years made these efforts difficult. No breakthrough came from the renewed investigations, leaving experts frustrated by the lingering gaps in the case. Psychological profilers also took a fresh look at the murders, attempting to piece together the mindset of the killer. They theorized that the crime was likely committed by someone with deep personal ties to the family, someone who knew the layout of the farm and the family's routines. Yet, despite these theories, no solid proof emerged to definitively name a suspect. The unsolved nature of the Hinterkaifeck murders continues to captivate the imagination of those who study the case. Could there still be a hidden clue somewhere buried in old records or missed during the original investigation that might finally reveal the truth? Or was the mystery of Hinterkaifeck destined to remain unsolved, a ghostly enigma that would continue to baffle experts for years to come? Even with today's technology, the case has left experts scratching their heads. Could the answer still be buried somewhere in Hinterkaifeck? As the years passed and the investigation stalled, various theories emerged about who could have been responsible for the horrific murders at Hinterkaifeck. The brutality of the crime and the strange clues left behind only fueled speculation, and to this day, no definitive answer has been found. Let's break down the most compelling theories and consider the possible motives behind this unspeakable tragedy. One of the most persistent theories points to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's former lover, and the man who claimed to be the father of her son, Joseph. Schlittenbauer's strange behavior during the discovery of the bodies, his calmness, his handling of the corpses made him a prime suspect. Some believe that a falling out over money or custody of Joseph could have driven him to commit the murders in a fit of rage. Others suggest that his knowledge of the farm and the family made it easier for him to carry out the crime without leaving many clues behind. But despite the suspicions, no concrete evidence ever tied him directly to the murders. Another theory involves a disgruntled worker or vagrant who may have been lurking near the farm in the days leading up to the murders. Hinterkaifeck's isolated location made it a possible target for drifters looking for shelter or work, and it's possible that a stranger, angered by rejection or fueled by desperation, could have carried out the crime. Several villagers had reported seeing unknown men near the farm in the days before the killings, raising the possibility that the murderer could have been an outsider who slipped away unnoticed after the crime. Then there's the unsettling possibility that the killer wasn't a stranger at all, but someone inside the family, such as Andreas Gruber himself. The dark rumors of incest between Andreas and Victoria had circulated in the village for years, leading some to believe that the patriarch's twisted control over his family could have exploded into violence. This theory, however, struggles to account for the death of Andreas himself, unless there was more than one person involved in the killings. Some even wonder if the murderer might have been someone deeply connected to the family's secrets, someone who felt betrayed or threatened by what they knew. The tangled web of relationships, financial disputes, and family dynamics left plenty of room for hidden motives. With so many possibilities and no hard evidence to point definitively in any direction, the case remains open to interpretation. Each theory has its merits and its flaws, but none have provided the closure that investigators and the families of those involved have been searching for. Let's break it down. Was it someone close to the family or a stranger who slipped in and out of their lives? What do you think? As we look back nearly a century after the horrific events at Hinterkaifeck, one thing is clear: the murders remain one of the most chilling and perplexing unsolved cases in history. Despite decades of investigation, speculation, and even modern forensic advancements, the truth about what happened on that cold, isolated farm continues to elude us. The gruesome nature of the crime, the strange clues left behind, and the conflicting theories all contribute to the haunting legacy of Hinterkaifeck. To this day, the case leaves more questions than answers. Who committed such an unimaginable act of violence? Was it someone the family trusted, a jealous lover, a mysterious stranger passing through? Or were the dark secrets within the Gruber family themselves at the heart of this tragedy? The longer the mystery endures, the more it captivates those who seek to unravel it. The Hinterkaifeck farm may be gone now, but its dark secrets still linger in the minds of investigators, historians, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Will we ever know the truth? Or is this case destined to remain unsolved forever, buried along with the victims? One thing is certain: the Hinterkaifeck farm still holds its secrets, and the truth may be lost forever. Or maybe, just maybe, we're closer than we think.